Welcome to the Nervous System Care and Healing Podcast, where we talk about how to take care of ourselves in mind, in body, in spirit, while we navigate systems that were designed to keep us dysregulated. I'm your host, Liz, a neurodivergent therapist of color, and I'm really glad that you're here. Hey everyone, I'm really excited to introduce you to today's guest, Halle Thomas. In this episode, we have a really beautiful conversation about expanding beyond the medical model to make therapy more inclusive and safe for folks with marginalized identities. We talk about what it looks like to have honest conversations about privilege, power, and oppression in the therapy room. And we talk about what it means to acknowledge ancestral responsibilities and to engage in intergenerational healing, whether you are your ancestors' wildest dream or their wildest nightmare, a term that Halle uses in our conversation. This is such a rich and profound conversation where we talk about things that don't often get talked about because they're uncomfortable or taboo, which is all the more reason to talk about it, in my opinion. And I'll start this off by sharing Halle's bio. So, Halle Monique Thomas, LPC, is an anxiety therapist who also works with trauma. Through brain spotting, parts work, and spiritually informed practices, she supports anxious adults whose anxiety stems from trying to follow rules that were written for them instead of by them. Halle's work also centers the lived experiences of BIPOC, queer, chronically ill, and neurodivergent folks. All right, now let's dive into the interview. As the audience is getting to know you, I'm wondering if you could share, in a nutshell, what drew you to this work as a therapist? Why do you do this work?
Well, I do this work because I kind of fell into it. It was actually never my plan to become a therapist. And I started off in college as a pre-med student because I'd had a lifelong dream of following in my dad's footsteps, becoming a doctor. I specifically wanted to become a plastic surgeon and specialize in burn reconstruction. And yeah, it was a very cool dream that I had. And I was very sad when I had to let that dream go. And it was because I realized at the time that I was in undergrad, my physical health and my own mental health at the time, they were not great. And it really impacted my ability to perform at the level that I needed to. And I made the decision during a chemistry final, actually. I turned it in half finished, crying.
Wow.
And put it, I remember placing it down in front of my professor whose office hours I had been in so many times. So he knew where I was at. But I handed in my half finished final and I made my way crying across campus to go change my major to psychology. The rest is kind of history. Going through those classes, I eventually ended up in a counseling psychology course. And that professor is who I really credit. Her name's Dr. Nancy Worsham. She's at Gonzaga University. I credit her with getting me into this because even with my previous dream, I just knew I wanted to work with people and I wanted to work with people closely and I wanted to work with their pain closely. But I also wanted to be in their joy and in their transformation, whatever that transformation looked like or meant for them. So I ended up here and, it's been almost 10 years. June will be 9 years since I saw my first ever therapy clients. And I'm not upset with how this has turned out. So that's saying something.
Yeah. Amazing. And really just how things pivoted and adjusted course from the original plan, which probably so many of us can relate to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know one of the things that we're really excited to talk about today is the medical model and specifically alternatives to that. So I'm curious if you could share what prompted you to divest from the medical model. How would you define the medical model? Just acknowledging that the medical model is considered the standard for how therapy is often conducted, but that there are alternatives to that.
100%. And this is another time where I love to remind people of like the medical model is a model. It is not the only way to do things. But as a model, we're looking at health being defined as the absence of disease. And in the mental health space, health defined by absence of mental illness and symptoms. The medical model also really understands symptoms as being pathological, of like you are having this symptom because something is wrong. And while that can be true, right? We often experience things when something is amiss. One of the problems I see for so many folks is that the medical model can sometimes lead people to feeling like something is wrong with them as an
Totally.
individual. And that is a problem to me, especially when we think about while there's so much progress that's happened in terms of destigmatizing mental health, that stigma's still there. So anytime that stigma has an opening to come up, I pay attention to that because it can take so much for folks to reach out for support and want to talk about things and even practice talking about things. But if they have that additional layer of, I'm having this experience and it means something is wrong with me,
Hmm.
now we're also needing to give attention to the shame that's been
Hmm.
internalized.
Yeah.
And that can be another barrier for folks.
Yeah. I just think about how that adds another layer where, like, there's the thing that's happening that may be causing distress. And then there's also the shame on top of that. So then the way the medical model just adds kind of another thing to work through.
It does. And I know this doesn't happen for everyone, but the other reason why I push back against it and divest from it is because of like my own family. You know, I was raised by a set of parents. My dad was a physician, family medicine doctor, and my mom was a clinical psychologist. So, two people who were very invested in the medical model.
Yeah.
Now, there's a little bit of nuance to be had here because my parents were different races.
Mm.
And for my dad, as a Black physician and one who was an older dad when he was going through medical school, that was in the 1950s. So if we think about the history of the United States,
Yeah.
how Black individuals have been treated by the medical system throughout time, my dad had kind of a unique position in that way of having his own ways of challenging the medical model,
Hmm.
but also really believing in being able to find problems that had cures and treatments. And while it was great in some ways because he was able to be a really safe provider, especially for people of color in general, not just Black folks. The way he talked to me about my own mental health had some
Mm.
problems
Okay.
because it was frustrating
Yeah.
for him to be like, well, what do you mean you're having, what do you mean you're depressed? We don't get depressed. That's like a
Mm.
white person thing. We don't have
Mm.
time for that. And it was interesting having those conversations start at home and parents with two very different lived experiences and trying to kind of find my own footing of like, well, what do I think and what do I know about my experience? And then all these years later, now as a provider, seeing the differences in terms of being really faithful to the medical model versus divesting from it.
What a significant experience to, grow up in a kind of multicultural household and then to also receive some of that messaging in your own home about, oh, you're having like this mental health experience. You're not supposed to be depressed. Kind of sounds like the
Yeah.
messaging.
This is a part too where like, okay, now we're going to go into another layer of nuance, which is that in addition to my household being multicultural, my parents also had a really significant age gap in their relationship. So they had an intergenerational marriage as well. And that totally informed how they both thought about mental health and what was going on for me. So, I had the experience growing up of knowing what both my parents did for work. And I remember being pretty young and telling my parents, I was like, I think I need to talk to a therapist. And actually, both of them didn't believe me, which is really interesting given that my
Yeah, even
mom was a clinical
clinical.
psychologist.
Wow, what an interesting.
So
Yeah.
they both were like, you're fine. And for me, it's so funny. I've actually never shared this, and I'm glad we're talking about it because I think it'll be helpful for some people, especially thinking about how neurodivergent children navigate the world. Because how I got listened to
Mhm.
was I knew that my middle school had a school counselor, and I knew that she was a mandated reporter. And I knew this because every year we were given a school issued planner that had like a bunch of information about resources at the school and when our breaks were and just all this information. So I literally am reading what I considered a manual to being a student. I figured out how to make an appointment with the school counselor and I told her how I was feeling. And I said, I think I'm depressed. Sometimes I want to hurt myself and I don't want to do that, but that's how it's making me feel. And she just looked at me eyes wide and was like, okay, so like, I'm going to have to call your parents. And like, I'm probably 9 years old at this point, and I'm like, cool, call my mom.
Yeah. You're like, I want help. I've been trying to get help. Wow.
And, looking back at it, it was a really big wake up call for both of my parents. But I
Mhm.
do genuinely have a laugh about it when I look back because I'm just like, if this isn't the most like type A, I'm following the rules, because people kept asking, like, how did you know to make this appointment? And why did you tell her that? And did you mean it? And I'm like, yeah, I meant it. I'm having a hard time. And
That's so brave of you. And also, I'm just so impressed that, like, at that young age, you knew how to navigate the system and what steps were needed to hit the button that would finally get some attention and care. We'll see
yeah,
where the story goes, but right, to
yeah.
follow, yeah, the steps. Mhm.
But it's part of too why I really think about navigating systems, because to be a child with very resourced parents, with very well informed parents too, and to still not be able to get the help that I genuinely needed at the time, I think that's some of where my own interest in like systemic problems and systemic inequities really started. Because from that point on, I was interacting with a bunch of different mental health care systems. And I saw the stuff that really hurt me, really was not attuned to my needs, and eventually helped me kind of create my own playbook for the type of therapist I knew I was not going to be once I did land on pivoting my career plans.
It's just so poignant and profound that, as you were going through the experience navigating the medical model, trying to get attuned support. And this reminds me of just how so many therapists enter the field or like healing profession of, okay, I did that. That didn't work for me. I saw how it actually ended up harming people or just not being as helpful as it could have been. I want to be a part of the change that, ushers in a different way of supporting people. Yeah. So then I wonder, in your work now, what like decentering the medical model has looked like in your work with clients who are queer, BIPOC, chronically ill, neurodivergent, and possibly like multiple intersections.
Yeah. I would say too, the majority of people I work with are at multiple intersections of identity. And I'm so glad that they are because it really enriches the conversations that we have about our work together, but also it enriches our conversations about what's possible. One thing that is sometimes different for people entering my practice is that diagnosis is not mandatory in my
Mm,
practice.
yeah.
I do not diagnose unless someone is seeking reimbursement from their
Mhm.
insurance provider,
Yeah.
or if someone is wanting to explore diagnosis to better understand their own experience.
Mhm.
And that's so different to have that even be presented as an option. And I get really, honestly, emotional about it because I know what that experience is like of finding out after the fact that you've been diagnosed with something that no one told you about, but that was also a
Mm.
misdiagnosis.
Oh, that's such a weird feeling and not good.
It's
Yeah.
very weird, very
Yeah.
weird. And I'm sensitive to it because not just because of my own experience, but because I get so many folks who land with me and they tell me about all of the different diagnoses they've been given. And I usually know within the first few sessions that at least half of them are incorrect.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm like
Yeah.
laughing about it because it's like, the bias runs so deep. And the number of people I work with who have been misdiagnosed, and specifically because their own neurodivergence was being missed, really, it bothers me and it irritates me because having a, diagnosis that actually does match your experience can be so helpful. It can be helpful for navigating systems. It can be helpful for, getting access to different kinds of care. But when you're given an incorrect diagnosis and then are further pathologized and stigmatized for it, that's not helping anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And what I really hear in your approach is this emphasis on autonomy and choice and also really challenging this hierarchy where like, okay, the mental health professional just puts the label on you, they decide for you and don't even tell you what they've decided versus let's have a conversation about it and in what ways would you find a diagnosis helpful? Do you want one? Also honoring the lived experience of the client or the participant in the healing process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the autonomy piece, too, because diagnosis is not mandatory in my practice, even if we end up exploring it later, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm putting it in people's charts either. The
Hmm. Yeah.
diagnosis can just stay in our conversation. And
Yeah.
if something comes up where someone's like, hey, I need a letter or I need a referral to like occupational therapy and they need to know what I'm diagnosed with. Like, of course, those are times that I will put it in writing. But otherwise, I'm not doing that until the client says it's okay. And it's because I'm also protective, and especially politically right now, the number
Mhm.
of changes that have happened just this last year,
Mhm.
let alone in even like the last 8, I am so protective of my clients' charts and their records and how I write up my own documentation,
Mhm.
because the last thing I want is for my clinical documentation to ever be able to be used to hurt my people. So
Right.
I get like
Yeah.
really into mama bear mode because I'm
Yes.
like,
Yes.
please
Yeah.
do not mess with my clients. Just don't do it because the world's already hard enough.
Right. Right. And I'm just so appreciating your mindfulness and your sensitive awareness of just how much power we could wield and do wield in our roles as licensed professionals, and that you're using this power mindfully to really protect your clients from the harms of the system or a diagnosis being weaponized against them in a way that they never consented to, especially in this political climate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that's also just very reparative and healing for some folks who have felt abused, gaslit, or mistreated by the medical system, to have a provider, a practitioner who's really looking out for them and in their corner.
Yeah. I mean, that is my hope, right? That is always my hope, that I am giving people a different experience from what they've had before, if they've had negative experiences in the past, or that if it's their first time in
Yeah.
therapy, that they are getting a baseline that like
Yes.
they should be expecting from anyone in this
Yes.
profession. And so that if they do have an experience where they're like, this doesn't seem normal, that they're able to flag that, because I think about that for myself, right? Of interacting with all of these different mental health care systems as a child and as a teenager, where I had no say. And even
Mm,
the stuff that I knew wasn't working for me and I knew it wasn't quite right, there wasn't anyone to really take that seriously, because it was, well, this is how this is done. And if you don't like it, it's because you're being defiant and non-compliant, right? Those
mhm.
2 words that so
Yeah.
often get used to describe BIPOC folks, queer
Yes.
folks, neurodivergent folks in
Right.
healthcare settings when they simply have questions,
Right.
right? That's
Right.
like such a
Yes.
pain point for so many of us. Asking a simple question so that we can better understand what's going on can get labeled as
Yeah.
being defiant.
Yeah.
So I don't want folks to have that experience with me. I
Yeah.
don't want them to have that experience, period.
Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
I know I'm not alone in this experience, but this is, part of why I also love doing this work is knowing, right? Like, I'm not the only therapist out there who's trying to get away from the really harmful stuff and building these practices that really allow people to be seen for all that they are, and where they don't have to compartmentalize themselves to be given the care that they need.
Yeah, especially when asking questions and just, right, being curious, does this apply to me? Would this work for me? Is actually a really healthy thing to do, but that gets pathologized through that medical lens. I want to kind of bring in another topic that I know we're excited to talk about, where, really the lived experience, the intersectional identities of clients is like it must be brought into the conversation. We can't have a conversation without acknowledging that. And I'm also curious how the topic of privilege shows up in your work with clients. Privilege, power, oppression.
Yeah, it's all the time. And that's the
Mhm.
way I like it.
Yes.
And I'm
Yes.
I'm also like laughing about this too, because I know that there's kind of been this wave that I have perceived of more therapists talking online of like, oh, like how do I talk about politics in therapy room? How do I talk about identity? And I sometimes chuckle about it because I'm like, I have been having these conversations since I was a child because of the home I grew up in. My dad was born in the 1930s in New Orleans. He grew up when segregation was very formalized. And so all of his stories and the way that he talked to me about the world was through those experiences that he had. And how my identity was different from his and different from my mom's. And it really set me up to be really comfortable, honestly, with conversations. And so I
It's
see this
beautiful.
come up in several ways. One, it comes up on my end, sometimes as the therapist. And when it's therapeutically appropriate, we'll talk about my own privileges that I have and how that influences the relationship with my client. There was a period of time when I first started my practice where I was working almost exclusively with Black folks, biracial Black folks, and interracial couples. And one conversation that would come up very often was around colorism and talking about, what is it like for someone with a darker complexion to be sitting with someone who does share in some of their cultural identity, but who is white assumed in many
Mm,
spaces.
mm,
And what biracial African American folks may represent to that person and harm they may have experienced from other people who look like me.
mm,
And so that's a conversation that I've had and will continue to have with folks.
mhm.
That could be a whole other podcast episode. So I will keep
Totally.
myself, I'm going to keep myself
Yeah.
contained. But that's one that comes up.
Yeah.
But for my clients too, the ones who especially are sitting at all these different intersections, I see my clients sometimes bring up their own privileges as a way to try to take away from the seriousness of their own struggles.
Mm,
And
yeah.
especially saying, like, well, you know, even though I'm multiracial and disabled and have, a learning disability, I still have, right, like the ability to pass as a straight person. And so maybe,
Mm,
maybe it's not that bad. And I should just like stop coming to therapy so that I can give someone with more problems the space.
mm,
And so that's one that I have to talk about and talk about how like this isn't a competition of who's in the most pain.
yeah.
We're talking about your pain
Yeah.
and how privileges do not always protect us from experiencing pain.
Yeah, and just so much nuance here. And I'm just thinking, like, honestly, what a gift it is that you offer this space and have really not just, it's not just talking the talk, but walking the walk of since a young age living in this space of nuance and being a bridge between like worlds that can be so like the way it gets talked about in mainstream society of that's over there, that's over here, nothing overlaps, things are literally black or white, but literally sometimes there's the nuance and the gray area in between.
There is. And that role of being the bridge is really important to me because I also think too about occasionally, it's not as frequent in my practice, but occasionally when I have clients who are white and want to work with me, those conversations around privilege are really interesting because they will sometimes come to me with, you know, essentially, what do I do with my white guilt? Like, I feel
Mm,
so bad that I have all these privileges that I didn't ask for. Does this mean I'm a bad person? Or I'm angry because I feel like people are telling me I'm a bad person. And so that's another angle to the privilege conversation, too. I always tell people, with my own identities and how much overlap there is. People make assumptions about me left and right, whether
I'm
it's my
sure.
racial identity,
Oh,
whether it's
yeah.
about my neurotype, whether it's about my disabilities. my queerness. So I hear and get the questions that people are terrified to ask other people. And I think it's a gift, honestly, because some of the things I'm like, I'm so glad you asked me and not someone else who you are going to like actually do relational damage to if you were to say this to them.
Yeah.
And being able to just really be with people in that moment, in that space, so that they can better understand not just themselves, but how to relate to other people too, because it is very rare that I encounter someone whose own biases really are coming out in a way where they are using it as a weapon. A lot of people really don't know. And I think it's frustrating sometimes to recognize that some people really don't know. But being able to meet those folks is important because it is not for everyone to do. I do not want everyone taking on that labor, but I'm really comfortable with it. So I'm like, ask me. Like, let's let's work through this together. Please don't take that over there because it's really going to go bad for you.
Oh, I love this so much. These are the conversations that need to happen, and they need to happen in a certain way so as not to cause that relational damage. And gosh, I mean, what honestly sacred work that you're doing, because of course the difference here is that you are consenting to being a person who holds
Yes.
space for this type of conversation. You are prepared and skilled and clearly have capacity for it, and also seems to bring you meaning and profound meaning to be that space for people. So I just really want to express gratitude for that.
And I appreciate that so much. I really do think about this being what I would consider an ancestral responsibility on my part. Because, sometimes we see that quote out in the wild of you are your ancestors' wildest dream. But for me, I'm like, for some of my ancestors, I am their wildest dreams. For some of my ancestors, I am their wildest nightmare. Existing as an openly queer, autistic, non-binary, biracial person, they would want me dead.
Right.
Oh,
You don't fit in any of the boxes that they want you in.
I don't fit in the boxes. And so I'm always in conversation with my ancestors. And for some of them who are really loving and supportive, I'm like, hey, this is who I'm sitting with today in a therapy session. I'd love to just really feel you with me while I'm with them and also with their ancestors. But for some of my ancestors, I do not talk to them in a very loving way. I'm very stern with them, where I'm like, hey, so you're going to hate this, but you also need to witness what's happening here, because the way you did this was so messed up and so awful, and you could have had a nice time just engaging with your cultural practices, but instead, you really decided that you were gonna, side with capitalism and white supremacy and settler colonial mindset. So I make them sit and watch what I do and engage with them in that way. And that's also work that I do with my clients, right? Who are like, I want to connect to, my culture, or I want to connect to my ancestry, but I don't know how to do that. And I'm like, well, guess what? You can do it your way. And that includes working with the people who weren't great and who really hurt people.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, this is giving me chills. Just the discernment you have, the way you relate to the ancestors, and how each relationship looks different depending on the context.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe a question as we're starting to wrap up here, although this could obviously be a 3-hour conversation.
It could be.
Yes, yes. I guess what's been the impact for you to kind of reconcile with the ancestral responsibility? Could you share more about the impact for also your clients, obviously without giving specific to you, but just like right
Yeah.
to reconcile with these are all the parts I'm holding, and what is a way forward that isn't dismissing the impact?
Yeah. So I'm someone who happens to know some things about my ancestry, right? And I've been able to do some like genealogy work as well to try to go farther and farther back, which is it's really challenging and really messy because the history for so many Black families, especially those who spent any time in the South, that work is painful because you will discover, as
Mhm.
I discovered, right, that
Yeah.
some of my ancestors were enslaved, but also some of them were fighting on the wrong side of the Civil War. And that's
Okay.
all on the Black side of my family, right? That's all within the same pool. But looking at, right, in my case, my mom's side of the family, they came to the United States way later in the game, had nothing to do with the slave
Mhm.
trade.
Mhm.
So, one is understanding that we all have our own assumptions about our own ancestry and like, well, who was doing the harm and where did it happen? And it's like sometimes it happens within the same family.
Mm.
And that
Yeah.
intergenerational trauma that happens from that has to be tended to in some way, shape, or form. For people who don't know about their ancestry, right? You know that there were people who came before you. And so I actually think it's so okay if you don't know anything about them, if you don't know their names, you know that they existed. You know they came from
Yeah.
somewhere. And so there's a real peacefulness that I've seen for some folks I've worked with being almost given permission. Not that I can give anyone permission to interact with their ancestors, but hearing someone talk about it in that way of like, it's okay if you don't know. You can put out a general call of like, hey, if there's anyone
Mhm.
who is supportive of me and is aware of my existence,
Mhm.
like, I'd love
Yeah.
it if you just like hung out with me for a little bit, or I'm leaving out some fresh water for you, or I'm inviting you to sit with me while I have this meal. That's okay. That's
Mhm.
really okay because there's so many reasons why we might not know who came before us or where our families were located. And I I don't think there needs to be reason for people to be left out of these practices when they are right there for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the openness with which you see all of this and also just acknowledging like things are more complicated than they may look or than we may assume and that just feels very tender. Information that we either consciously learn about our ancestry or that may unconsciously, live in our bodies. But what I hear from you is that there's always opportunity for connection and that
Mhm.
connection can look whatever way it looks.
Yes.
Yeah. So, the final question that I want to ask, what is one way that you like to take care of your nervous system?
I love this question and I was so excited when I knew we were going to talk about it cuz I'm like I now get to be on my soapbox for a moment to tell everyone about sensory breaks
Great.
because I am a really big advocate for people learning about their own sensory needs,
Mhm.
but then using that information to take sensory breaks that match those needs. So for me, I am someone who tends to be pretty sensory avoidant.
Mm.
I kind of like want to flee and go into myself or into my own inner world. So I give myself sensory deprivation breaks. I take at
Mm.
least one a day.
Nice.
And for me, that often looks like laying on the floor or like laying in my bed. I will put on an eye mask. I will put on noise canceling headphones. I will just lay there. I might hang out with, whether it's ancestors or like part of my like spirit crew that hangs out with me. I'll be with them in that space. It's so regenerative for me and so
Mm.
restorative. And I
Yeah.
always notice, even if I go into kind of a sensory deprivation break like that, and my nervous system is just really high key
Mhm.
and really like buzzing,
Mhm.
it always comes back down to a place where my breathing slows down, right? And I
Mm.
notice like my body temperature shifts and gets a little cooler. And sometimes it takes 5 minutes.
Mhm.
Sometimes it takes 20, knowing that that's okay. And that's my body and my nervous system doing what it needs to do. But those sensory breaks really help me to not pathologize my own dysregulation, right? Because like the
Yeah.
whole point of our nervous systems is to get dysregulated when something's off
Yes,
and let us know.
exactly. Yes. Yes.
So if anything, I'm able to just use that information loop and go like, oh, we're a little dysregulated. I wonder if I want to move my sensory break up a little earlier in the day, or maybe today's a day where I need 2 of them. But it can look so many ways for folks. For sensory seekers, going on a flower smelling walk is always a great one, or bird spotting, things like that allow you to get really into that like visual seeking or auditory seeking or olfactory seeking. It can be so customized, but that is my favorite way
Yeah.
to do it.
Amazing. Yeah. I love a good sensory break. I know I didn't really get an education early on how do you take care of your nervous system or how can you tell if you're overstimulated. It was just like power through. To actually build that into your life and design your life around it just sounds so supportive.
It
Yeah.
really is.
Well, it's been so lovely to learn from you, Haley. As we end here, where can people find you if they want to connect and work with you? And could you tell us a bit about your offerings?
Yeah. Well, you can find me anywhere you'd possibly think of. I'm probably there. So
Okay, great.
my website is chicorycounseling.com. And I am on every possible social media channel at
Great.
Chicory Counseling. So Instagram is
Amazing.
where I am the most active, followed by Threads, YouTube, then TikTok.
Great.
So wherever you are, I will also be there.
Wonderful. We love that. Yes, the ancestors love that. Yeah.
They're everywhere.
Yes.
And for folks who are based in Colorado or Oregon, you're people who I'm able to work with in therapy. Those are the 2 states where I'm licensed to practice. I'm based in Colorado, but I've maintained my Oregon license because that's where the work all started. So if you're interested in working together, going to my website is the best way to check out, what weekly therapy looks like with me, but also what brain spotting therapy intensives look like with me. And
Mhm.
Liz, I know you share in this. Intensives are such a great way to do the same work that we would do in weekly therapy, but in a much more immersive way where, we're working with an extended stretch of time with each meeting rather than 50 minutes. So it makes it a little more conducive to getting into work that can be a little harder or feel a bit more fragmented in the weekly format. So those are the 2 ways that you can work with me. I've also got a free download that's available to anyone on my website, and there are some non-traditional journal prompts
Yes.
for reducing anxiety, and it's the exact same questions that I've asked so many clients that I want as many people as possible to have, just so that they can start exploring that for themselves and kind of go beyond like, well, how do I cope?
Yeah.
It's like, well, we've got to do a little more than just coping, especially these days. And the questions that are in that guide will be really supportive for that work.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Haley. And we'll be sure to leave all of those links in the show notes, including the free download about reducing anxiety and like creative questions around that, which I'm sure folks will find really helpful and perhaps refreshing to have something
Yes.
a bit different than the usual like cope as a tip. So thank you so much. And just for being so available in all the ways you make your work accessible online and including being on this podcast and just sharing just so openly. family. This is such a gift and treasure. So
Well, thank you so much
Haley.
for having me. Thank
Yeah.
you. I so enjoyed our chat, and
Me too.
I'm excited for people to hear it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nervous System Care and Healing podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. And if you ever have a few minutes to leave a rating and review, it would mean so much to me, and it helps other people to find the podcast and spread the care. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy, coaching, or professional mental health services. The information shared here is generalized, it may not reflect every individual nuance, and it should not be interpreted as personalized mental health advice. So please do seek out additional support if you need it. Take care and be well. This is Liz at Nervous System Care and Healing.